At the time, horse culture spread in the region east of the Mississippi and west of the Rocky Mountains, but in both cases it was restricted, never developing to any extent north of Virginia or the Ohio on the east, or north of California on the west. Oh, so it was over to California, not Oregon. I take back what I said just a minute ago. A study of the influence of the horse on the Plains Indians brings us to the threshold of history. Some of the effects may be cited. In general, it is maintained the horse did not introduce new qualities into Plains culture. The true Plains Indians already possessed the traits they continued to exhibit. They were nomadic, non-agricultural, warlike, people who depended primarily on the buffalo herds for sustenance. None of those changed. They continued to be nomadic, warlike, non-agricultural people who depend on the buffalo. What the horse did was to intensify these traits. They were even more nomadic. They were even less interested in agriculture, and the buffalo was even more a part of their lifestyle. So the horse ushered in the golden era of the Plains Indians. Interestingly. Something brought over by European civilization. To the white man, especially to the Anglo-American, the Indian was primarily a warrior, a fighting man, an implacable foe. Now, those of you who believe that Indians were environmentally conscious, altruist communists, what do you think is the nature of the white man's reaction to the Indian? They thought of the Indian as a warrior. Was that pure racism and hatred on their part, or was it out of experience of actual events? I put it to you. The Indians, quoting again, the Indian's economy of life, his philosophy, he didn't have a philosophy, his soul, were secondary and of little concern to the Anglo-American. It was only the Indian in war paint and feathers and on the warpath that ever gave the pioneer anything serious to think about. Therefore, so far as the Indian goes, the historical problem comes down to the single issue of his ways in war, his methods and his weapons. So, there we go. There's an essential key to the clash between white man and Indian. That the Indian was bent on destruction. It was his way of life. And the white man was there to produce and improve and create industry and agriculture. And war was the only occupation of the Indian. By the time the white men came in contact with them, the Plains Indians were mounted. Furthermore, they were the only mounted Indians in the whole history of the American frontier, whether English or Spanish. The records of the eastern woodland region do not reveal that the Indians who fired the cabins and scalped the settlers were horse Indians. In the forest region, the Indian went on foot, protected by the forest and the thick growth of underbrush. A horse would have been a hindrance and a danger, easily followed and easily found. Now, that became less and less true as time went on, but he means originally, historically, when we were just encountering these tribes and stuff. But the horse, being less important, did spread to these other cultures and so on. It just didn't completely revolutionize and take over their way of life. So, he's talking about the earlier time periods there. So, the Indians of the Plains were the only mounted Indians that the American frontiersmen ever had to meet. Now, like I say, later on, horses were spread throughout, but the people on the frontier, where there was no civilization and so on, they were meeting Indian tribes that were not mounted, and then they came to the plains and met the Indian tribes that were mounted. Later on, horses, as I said, became ubiquitous. The second point is the Plains Indians were the most formidable Indians to face or to fight that were found anywhere on the American frontier. For this, there are several possible explanations. 1. The Plains Indians were nomadic and had no settled village life. Therefore, they could not be destroyed in their own homes as the timber Indians could. Their homes were wherever they were, wherever they chose to camp, though each tribe did have its own range, which was generally recognized by other tribes, though not always respected. So you can't locate their center of power and destroy it. They were nomadic. That's why I was saying earlier, people just recognize you're going to have to destroy the buffalo herds. It's going to be the only way to get rid of these savages. The Plains Indians were by nature, point number 2, the Plains Indians were by nature more ferocious, implacable, and cruel than the other tribes. Some people might scoff at the idea, saying that's a little too subjective, how could you prove that? Continuing the quote then, perhaps this cannot be proved, but certain well-established facts make it certain that no other tribes, either in the woodlands or the desert, exceeded the Plains tribes in these respects, namely being ferocious and cruel. In the first place, it may be stated that the Plains Indians were the least civilized of all tribes. Historians in the 19th century distinguished clearly between civilized Indians, or the eastern tribes, and wild Indians, or the Plains tribes. I pause for a second there. Did you know that, ladies and gentlemen? And ultimately, the answer was to just do away with them altogether, to drive them west, because they were a separate culture. Even the ones that were at peace with us, even the civilized tribes in the east, it was recognized that they're an independent people, they're an independent nation, they're an independent culture, and we either are going to have to push them out, or in some future we're going to have to deal with this sovereign nation in our territory. And they couldn't deal with us. If you want to put it that way, we were a sovereign nation who established a foothold in their territory, but, tough shit. Civilization marches on. People who are in the Stone Age don't have a right to hold land against people who have muskets and plows. So, but anyways, even the civilized ones eventually had to be pushed out, and maybe didn't have to be, but eventually were pushed out. And I think probably had to be. I think it was probably a good policy to say, if you won't assimilate, move into our cities, and do things our way, then leave. Go. Out to the borderlands, out to some scrub brush or something. We are productive. We are going to use this land in a productive way. We're going to improve it. We're going to raise families, and we're going to have good lives. If you don't want to partake of that type of event that's going to be going on, get off this land. I don't care if your ancestors were here before our ancestors. What we care about is the use of the land productively. We are going to use it productively, and we're not going to let some other type of culture stand in the way and say, no, you can't have fields, we have to hunt this whole forest for our little teeny tribe or whatever. So I stand by even the borderline cruelty of driving the Indians out of the east, who were, even by the standards of the time, civilized. Alright, continuing it. In the second place, the frontiersmen on the plains soon learned that one could not surrender to an Indian. That's a scary thought. You get in a scrap, it says in just a second here, save a bullet for yourself. Save the bullet. Don't shoot your last shot. You don't shoot till it's empty, because you don't want to be caught by an Indian or by Indians. The Indians rarely, if ever, surrendered themselves, and they had no concept of the white man's generosity to a vanquished foe. If one cannot surrender, one must flee or fight, and in the end must die rather than fall alive into the hands of the enemy. Whether this stern code was fully developed in the eastern woodland is uncertain, but it was fully developed in the plains. There is evidence to show that in their fights with the Plains Indians, white men learned to save one bullet for themselves. That is creepy. As for cruelty, the Plains Indians had reduced it to an art. And now we get a quote from Colonel Dodge, "The hunting grounds of the Great West." In the footnote it says the Indians would take women and children prisoner, but would hold warriors only to torture. So here's the quote from Colonel Dodge. "Cruelty is both an amusement and a study. So much pleasure is derived from cruelty that an Indian is constantly thinking of new devices of torture and how to prolong the utmost those already known." Creepy. "His anatomical knowledge of the most sensitive portions of the human frame is wonderfully accurate, and the amount of beating, cutting, slashing, and burning that he will make a human body undergo without seriously affecting the vital powers